Greetings and welcome to the Dream Syndicate. In today's video, we're going to be making a posable wizard art doll, so let's get crafting. Before I did any sculpting, I did some sketching to figure out what the character and the finished illustration would look like. I also did some color studies to see how the various colors work together. From there, we can make a ball of tinfoil. I'm putting a piece of aluminum tubing in the wizard doll's neck because I want it to be thinner. And then we'll add polymer clay pieces to form the basic shape of the head. I'll put links to everything you'll need to make a character like the one I'm making below in the description and pinned comment. Now we'll just use our clay tool to poke dots where the eyes will go, and I like characters with deep eye sockets, so I'll press those in with my thumb and a large ball stylus. Next we'll place balls of pre-baked original Sculpey for her eyeballs. The nose is just going to be a long, kind of flat triangle shape. We use a fingertip, a teeny little ball stylus, and whatever else gets the job done to blend the bridge of the nose to the rest of the face. And then we'll add a ball of clay to form the tip of the nose and blend that down. Using a pointed tool and a small ball stylus, we'll create the nostrils. You don't have to dig in there super deep. If someone's really looking up your art doll's nose, be concerned. Here I'm just refining the shape around the eyes to the nose. I'm often making minor tweaks on a head sculpt. For the lower eyelid, we'll add a little clay strip, dab it down with our thumb, use our tools to blend it, and then form tiny wrinkles. Towards the end of shaping the lower lid, you want to create a distinct line on the top of it that slopes down. We'll pretty much do the same process for the upper eyelid, just with a thicker clay strip, and our tiny wrinkles will be a bit more pronounced. If you end up using any of my techniques, I'd love to see them. You can tag or mention me wherever you're sharing your clay creations. Next we'll make a line for her mouth. At first I thought I was going to make her mouth open a little. Here's a little clay strip for her lower lip, we'll blend that down. And another smaller one for her upper lip. We'll use a tiny ball stylus and a clay tool to blend it in and also get the shape right. I ended up wanting the character to have more of a closed mouth, so I pressed upward on the lower jaw and then refined the line between the lips. Taking two balls of clay, we'll create wedge shapes for the ears, and then start to shape and blend them with our small ball stylus. What I'm doing here is roughing up the surface to help the two parts we're going to attach bond together. The final art's called Manifest Garden, and I'll show you the full final art I made with this art doll toward the end of the video. I'll spend a little time trying to get the ears to look symmetrical-ish. Now we'll create a divot, sort of like the shape of an animal's ear. Pressing in on the ear dislodged the clay a bit, so what we'll do is add some clay strips to the back and then blend it to thicken the ears, creating a hemispherical bump. Then we'll take a small ball stylus and create some shapes on the inside of the ear. I'm kind of thinking of the interior of a person's ear, but I'm also kind of making it up. Shh, don't tell anyone. The head sculpt's all done, and we're ready to fire her in the oven. And now for the magical incantation.
Higher, higher, burning fire, making music like a choir.
I'm going to give her long hair that can be posed, so I'm putting dots where I'm going to place armature wire. We'll drill holes where we marked. You don't want to drill too deep. I've destroyed at least one head sculpt by a drill bit shoving out an eye. It wasn't pretty. Next, we'll braid a few pieces of wire. Then we'll mix equal parts epoxy resin. When you're using this stuff, be sure to have a well-ventilated area. Plenty of artist materials or some degree of toxic. We use a toothpick to put several dabs of epoxy resin in each hole and then install the wires. This stuff starts to set in 5 minutes, so you want to work fast or only do things in sections you're sure you can get done in that time. I also applied dabs to the tops of the holes to have the hair wires firmly installed. In a few hours when the epoxy is set, we'll paint a base tone for this wizard art doll. Since I'm going to be using a fair amount of pale pinks and oranges in the flesh tones, I used a cadmium red undertone. For the darker areas, like in the nostrils and between the lips, I applied a raw umber. I'll have to do a better job of keeping track of my color palettes, but for this character, I think it was mainly naphthol red mixed with white. I used earth tones like raw sienna, raw umber, chromium green, and yellow ochre. If you want to join me in making the imaginary reality, don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon. I'm breaking parts of the head down into zones. Areas that wouldn't be exposed to a lot of sunlight are paler and duller. The character's name is Lalora, though her proper title is Manifest Lalora. The Manifest in this world I'm slowly building are these wizard-like beings who have the power to manipulate reality. At the end of this video, I narrated a short bit of text about her. Areas that would be the most exposed to the sun get painted darker and warmer tones like the top of the forehead, bridge of the nose, tip of the nose, and the top of the nostrils. We'll start out with a layer of these tones being really exaggerated, what I call the clown stage, but as the painting progresses, we'll rein it in. Since my brush isn't fine enough to paint just the insides of the eyelids, I end up filling in the whole eye with this dark purple. I'll go back and paint the eyeball white again later. Now we'll paint the head this peachy tone and a pale pink. Here we'll brush in little areas of a darker pink on the cheeks and the chin. And we'll put some of that darker pink along the upper ridge of the ears. We'll spend a little bit of time pushing and pulling the nose between a pale and a darker red. The nose area is going to get paler as we get closer to the eyes, but darker on the top plane as it goes away from the face. There's this grayed out blue around the eyes that will add some dots of a paler off-white and sort of spread it around so you have this gray blue faintly showing through. I went with purples for the eyelids because the color would coordinate with the pale oranges and the flesh tones, as well as the iris color. The upper eyelid's a darker tone, while the lower is a more muted version. And we'll fill in the whites of the eyes again. Then start to paint an iris an emerald tone. I like a black outline around the iris, so sometimes I find it easier to just paint a black circle, let that dry, and then paint the iris so there's a slight black line ringing it. And we'll noodle with a few tweaks around the face. I also decided to use more vibrant green for the eyes. Now we'll just add the dots for her pupils. And we have a painted head. It looks pretty good if I do say so myself. Using our wire cutters, we'll cut down the length of the hair wires and get ready to give this art doll some fabric hair. For hair, I like to use a fabric that has a bit of a sheen to it, so I picked this white. It was a little sheer, you could see the armature wire through it, so I doubled it over and sewed the pieces together. I experimented with how the fabric was arranged on the head to form a shape that felt like hair. When I found shapes I liked, I pinned it in place and applied fabric tack to the scalp. Then we'll use a whip stitch, aka my go-to stitch, along the hair's length with a matching thread. When making hair this way, you might want to leave the ends of the thread long that you cut off so it looks like strands of flyaway hair. I'll repeat this a few more times, pinning things into place, sewing, attaching the root of the hair to the scalp, and just trying to make hair that looked right to me. It's really a trial and error process. Since there's so many long strands of hair, sewing parts of it is challenging as I'm trying to prevent my sewing thread from becoming knotted with these pieces. We'll just wrap a little paper tape around the armature wire that's going into the neck, which will help her not lose her head. I measured and marked the art doll's arm armature wire, and now we'll snip off the excess. Then we'll wind some paper tape around to help hold the posable hands. The paper tape is thicker towards the marker line, so as the tube for the hand slides up the wire, it'll fit more tightly. Now we'll just slide on her hands. If you want to see how you can make posable hands like these, you can click the link in the corner. It's tiny tailor time! We'll take a measurement of the length and width and sketch out those dimensions, plus a little extra, a seam allowance, on our fabric. You also want to take note of the spacing of the character's shoulders and sketch in slits for armholes. We'll use our fabric scissors to cut out her shirt. Then we'll use an X-Acto for her armholes. Now we'll put the start of this sort of dress shirt on her. It's not very stylish yet, but give it time. We'll fold over the overlapping part of the fabric to give it a clean edge and pin it into place. I'm making some on-the-fly adjustments, so I'll trim this bit of extra fabric here. Here we'll create a side seam by pressing in towards the center, gathering and pinning it into place. And we'll just sew up each side of the shirt. Later, we'll sew up the shoulders with all the extra fabric we have there. But first, we'll pin what will become the neck seam. Starting from the bottom, we'll run some thread along the front of her shirt, sewing the folded over fabric to the piece beneath it, locking the front of the shirt in place. Then we'll take care of the neck seam. Now we'll sew the shoulder seams. I can make my stitches fairly uniform, but I'm not a perfectionist about every single stitch's spacing. It's more about the overall look of the stitching. One thing I do like to do is make sure that each stitch starts from the same side. Like, if I start my stitching from the front side on the shoulder on the right, I like to mirror that on the opposite side. We'll measure the arms and transfer that onto our shirt fabric. I often end up trimming a 45-degree angle off of the corners. I do this because otherwise I usually get some weird edges sticking out of the sleeve seams. It's helpful to crease your fabric by firmly sliding your finger along it, though some fabrics will hold this line better than others. We'll spend some time carefully pinning the sleeve to the shoulder area of the shirt and around the armature wire. It's important that you like the look of the sleeve as it's pinned because your sewing is going to create seams that more or less look like the way you've pinned it. We'll just sew around the shoulder. It only takes like 5 or 6 stitches to do this, so it goes by pretty quickly. And we'll stitch up the length of her sleeve. I don't always start with one or another when it comes to attaching the sleeve to the shoulder or sewing up its length, but I do always start with the length of the sleeve from the shoulder to the hand. If you're an accomplished sewer, I'd love to get your opinion on the great shoulder versus sleeve controversy. Which one should you sew first? We'll measure the length of this lace trim, creating a fancy collar, and attach it. My bottle of Fabri-Tac is a little old, so I have to blob it on spots as opposed to tracing smooth, thin lines. I think in the future I'm only going to buy the smaller bottles. After a certain shelf life, it becomes almost impossible to work with. I ended up wasting too much of it with the big 8-ounce bottles. Similarly to creating the collar, we'll fancy up the sleeves with the lace. Next we're going to sew these 3 panels together to make a dress from this emerald velvety looking fabric. We'll get everything nicely pinned, and we're ready to sew the 2 pieces together. Since this stitching won't be visible, I didn't separately pin both sides of this seam. We'll flip it inside out, and voila, we have our dress. But I'm just going to quickly go back and create a neater seam on the bottom. Attaching it to the art doll, it's kind of oversized around the waist, but we'll sew a gathering stitch, working the needle in and out, and pull the thread tight when we get to the end. And we'll try to keep the tension in the thread as we tie it off. Next, we're going to give her a jacket of a fabric with a similar color as the dress, but has a different texture. We'll determine where we want the bottom of the jacket to fall and pin a seam for it. Around the shoulder was also pinned, and now we'll sew that up. When you're sewing, you can either try to make the stitches as invisible as possible, or you can use them as an aesthetic choice. In this case, I chose a pale blue that contrasts with the emerald of the jacket. I've always enjoyed stuffed animals and character designs where the stitching's visible and a strong part of the design choice. This jacket's going to be held together with a large belt, so I'm not worried about the overlap of the material all that much. I'm thinking of it as a piece that has more of a center line, rather than the way suit jackets tend to have a line that falls to the left or to the right. We'll give the character's form a better silhouette by creating a side seam, otherwise the jacket ends up looking like a baggy mass. I want to refine the shape even further, so I'll fold over a flap of fabric between the shoulders and add a few stitches. We'll keep it going with more of that fancy trim. This fabric doesn't take creases nearly as well as the white dress shirt did. The art doll's clothes are finished, but I wanted to make it more fantastical. I had this gold wire laying around, as one does, so I decided to start bending it into some interesting geometric shapes. I wanted her dress to have these strange, intricate sigils all over, and wasn't quite sure how I was going to do it. I was hoping to find fabric with interesting patterns already embroidered on it, but didn't have any luck. I thought to do some version of embroidering myself, but that could also take a lot of time. I'd also thought I could just paint the designs on the fabric, but didn't think I'd like the look of it. When I had the idea to use wire, I thought it'd give the doll a strange, otherworldly look. I played around with making a bunch of abstract shapes. I kinda wanted them to have the look of music notes, and I chose about half of them to sew to the dress. Since it'd be hard to show you how I attached them inside the dress, I'll show you what I did on this scrap of fabric. I created a bunch of connection points, often where wire looped around or overlapped, and used those points to tack the wire forms into place. And here's her dress, all decorated in the strange sigils. Now we'll cut a length of trim to add to the bottom hem of the dress and fabric tack that on. Once it's dry, you could go back and sew over top of it if it's a look you wanted. I have this button that's going to serve as a belt buckle, but I'd really like it to be gold, so I'm going to paint it. The paint covered the openings that were in the button, so I went back and opened them up with a pin. I applied 3 coats of the gold paint, and when it was done, I snipped off the back part of the button with wire cutters. I had this trim that I thought would make a cool belt and loved the way it looked against the emerald green. The only problem was that the ends wanted to fray when I cut it. I ran some fabric tack across it, which helped to lock it into place. We'll use a closely matching thread to sew the 2 ends of the belt together. And just use a generous dab of fabric tack to hold her belt buckle in place. I wanted this character to feel prim and proper, maybe even to a contrived level, but have this underlying current of power to her, kind of like this The Lord of the Rings scene with Galadriel.
In place of a dark lord, you would have a queen! Not dark, but beautiful and terrible as the dawn! Treacherous as the sea! Stronger than the foundations of the earth! All shall love me and despair!
What's a good fantasy wizard without some totem of power like a wand or a staff? I took some transparent beads and wire and wound it around the stick to create Lalora's mystical staff. I could also see this working as a wand if you wanted to get up to your own wizarding. More than a good many slummers express warm feelings when the name of Manifest Lalora is brought up, even when they voice their concerns with any important signs and augurs that point to the foretold great unraveling being at hand in a generation or so. During these brief encounters, on the way to some grand gala or the gates of her alabaster villa, she merely tisks and dismisses such dreary concerns with a well-rehearsed, lilting, "If we were to cease off our sustaining endeavors, why, that would weaken our great nation, the power of the sleeping emperor, and leave so many of our realm without the capacity to take care of themselves and their family. Now, most assuredly, you must not want that." Never mind the fact that the Great Unraveling was foretold as a grand apocalypse that would seize industry, the nation, the sleeping emperor, the slumbers and their families, and Manifest Lalora for that matter as well. Manifest Garden is available as a print. I'll put a link to where you can get one if you're interested. This video would have been ridiculously long if I included all the other footage I took, but I'll release it as a couple additional videos. One where I show you the making of this critter, a Suthril, and the other where I show you some of the other background elements being made. As I get them finished, I'll put everything in a playlist for you to check out. Thanks so much for watching. If you want to join me in making the imaginary reality, don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon. Until next time, make believe.